Hi, this is Tim Brando with a reminder. Those of you on Tide 100.9, look out. You're about to feel the buzz of Stingray.
This is Stephen Ray, a.k.a. Stingray, coming to you live from Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
I'm Heath Hopkins. I'm here in DeSoto County, Mississippi, right outside of Memphis, Tennessee. You know, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you feel that responsibility to pay it forward and give some kid a chance coming up in the ranks, kind of like Tony did for you?
Why do you think I'm talking to Stingray tonight?
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
No, I mean, look, no.
Hey, Stingray, here's the deal. When you get involved with Texas, it's like getting married to a stripper. and let me explain this. It looks good. It's kind of sexy on the surface. Yeah. But then you get the baggage, you get the drama, you get all that eventually comes with it. And that's what you get with Texas, and that's what the Big 12 learned.
And Heath, any thoughts on our show moving forward?
Hey, to everyone in Tuscaloosa listening here on Tide 100.9, with the Stingray Show, if you don't like it, you better learn to love it, because it's the best show going today, baby. Woo!
Welcome back inside the Stingray Show. Our guest this evening that we are about to get to is Graham Hall of 247 Sports Gators. And to talk about the Florida Gators, who come in as a number 1 seed, who also have to play the 16 seed Norfolk State. And Florida comes in with a record of 30-4, and they are your SEC tournament champions, as on Sunday they knocked off the Tennessee Volunteers in Nashville in a dominating fashion. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Graham Hall to give us a preview of the Florida Gators. Graham, how are things with you, knowing that the Gators are SEC tournament champions for the first time since 2014?
I'm doing great. It's been great to cover this team all year long. I'm getting ready to go up to Raleigh for their first round matchup with Norfolk State, and then we'll see who they play if they get out of that one, as they should, no offense to Norfolk State, and play on Sunday against either UConn or Oklahoma. But, you know, this is a team that you got to celebrate their accomplishments, even as they maintain this underdog mentality, which I wrote about earlier this morning on Swamp 247. They're not letting the noise and the praise from everyone out there, from ESPN to CBS, get to them. This is a team that still has their chip on their shoulder and is going to use that to carry them into what their hope is a deep run in March. And they celebrated that SEC tournament on the floor as the confetti fell in Nashville. But as they were celebrating, they were walking around saying 6 more to go. This is a team that has their sights set on greater achievements, and it all kicks off Friday in Raleigh.
So briefly, if you would, go ahead and do a quick review of the Florida Gators in Nashville. They are in the SEC tournament, and then we will move to the NCAA bracket.
Yeah, they faced a Missouri team on Friday who I think is one of the more underrated teams in the country. I don't know if people have been paying attention to how good Missouri has been. I think that Dennis Gates certainly deserves all the acclaim that he has gotten. You know, the 45-year-old head coach. They went winless last year in SEC play, and then were one of the SEC's better teams this year. And they beat Florida earlier in the year. They got a 1-point victory in Gainesville. That's Florida's only home loss of the 2024-25 regular season. And they were playing without Mark Mitchell, who is arguably their best player up there with Tamar Bates. And Missouri gave Florida, you know, a battle there for as much as they could handle in that game. You know, they won the offensive rebounding battle. They had 18 offensive rebounds. They knocked down 30 shots. But you saw how good Florida really is. Scored 90 points, over 90 points in that game, and just was able to score in a variety of ways, play impressive defense, and they end up getting, a 16-point victory over that Missouri team. And then they set up a battle with an Alabama team that looked really, really good, you know, the other night when they advance to the semifinal round of the SEC tournament. That's a team that handled Kentucky. They got over a 25-point win in that game, and a team that can score in a variety of ways. Not to say Florida got lucky in that game, but it was back and forth early, and then Mark Steers got a little bit banged up, and then Grant Nelson suffers what I believe was a knee injury, and he doesn't play in the second half, and then Florida just dominates them the rest of the way, gets that 22-point victory. They get up to 104 points against that Alabama team, which is an incredible feat, absolutely, here. And it sets up their third game in as many days, where they take on a Tennessee team that the Gators had split the series this season with the Volunteers. I think a lot of people remember that back on January 14th, Florida got that 30-point victory over a then undefeated Tennessee team. And then Tennessee got their revenge less than a month later when Florida went to Knoxville, and the Volunteers got a 20-point win in a game that, Walter Clayton got hurt in that game and was banged up. But, Tennessee was playing without a pair of starters in that game too. And it was an impressive performance by them, particularly on the defensive end. They held Florida to a season low points in 44 points. And so it sets up a rematch in the SEC tournament championship where Florida gets the better of the Volunteers. I'm not going to put words in their mouth necessarily, but from everything I've gathered, Tennessee is their number one rival in the SEC, two programs that just do not like each other. And so to get it against that team certainly was a little additional incentive, for Florida in that game here. And they looked really, really good. Walter Clayton just knocks down shot after shot that often, you kind of still sit there in amazement at what he's able to do. Alex Condon is really effective. They've got a contingent of forwards who are really, really impressive, from Thomas Houck to, Micah Hanlogton coming back here, the 7'1" center who missed the previous 11 months and then returns from that devastating injury that he suffered in last year's SEC tournament champion, and just gives them, a starter caliber player that is coming off the bench. He had 10 rebounds and I think just 14 minutes against Alabama. Just gives you an option that's a luxury off the bench here. Obviously, Ruben Chinyelu is a fantastic defensive player as well. And then you look at that backcourt. I mentioned Clayton, but it's not just him. Elijah Martin, Will Richard, two really, really great defensive players who can knock down open shots from long range, can drive to the rim and finish through contact. This is a team that it's hard to find a weakness for them. They got a deep bench. They can play 9-10 guys on any given night. You take away one option, Florida's got several more who can do some damage to you. And when you get into March and you have a top 10 defense and you've got a deep roster, even if you have a cold shooting night, you can withstand and overcome a lot of those things here with your defensive play, because defense carries into March, in my opinion. So for Florida, it's an exciting time for fans down in Gainesville, because this is looking like a team that has a chance to go all the way in the NCAA tournament.
Graham, fun question. What was the worst game Florida's played all year? What game was that?
It's probably Tennessee. I mean, it's understandable. They score 44 points. They go into a hostile environment. Not only was Walter Clayton injured in that game, but Elijah Martin had an off shooting night, which you're not going to see too much from him. Will Richard was taken out of the game. He was limited on his catch and shoot attempts. They limited his baseline drives. Florida just really didn't have much offensive firepower in that game. And it resulted in what's now an outlier. This is a team that is not going to be held below 50 points very, very often, but that happened up there in Knoxville. And so that's probably their weakest performance once we got into 2025. But I also think it's worth mentioning that this team was still coming along in non-conference play, and they went undefeated in non-conference play. They played North Carolina really tight. They had to withstand a furious Florida State comeback in mid-November. This is a team that, has gotten better as the season has progressed, which is one of the more impressive things about them. But that Tennessee game is probably their weakest performance of the season. It's an understandable one, and it's one that they're motivated to not let happen again. Injuries and poor shooting nights, they can culminate and come together, and that's what happened in Knoxville in front of a hostile crowd for them. But, to their credit, even more so than the losses here, is that Florida never had back-to-back losses this season. Even with guys like Condon getting injured, Walter Clayton playing on an injured ankle, Will Richard has had a toe injury that has bothered him throughout the last really 2 months. They never had a losing skid this season. They never lost back-to-back games. Not only that, but after every loss that they had in SEC play, they bounced back with a double-digit win.
Yeah.
That's really tough to do, not just and especially in this conference. I mean, this is a conference that got, 14 teams in the NCAA tournament. I know a lot of people out there are crying about it, but a conference that certainly, in my opinion, deserved to get, 13 at-large bids in the conference. And to do it against this level of competition and not have a losing streak just says a lot about their mentality, their focus, their ability to bounce back, make corrections, not let one loss bleed into two. That's probably the most impressive thing of the season for them. But that worst loss of the year is the Tennessee one, and they were motivated to get some redemption, which they did on Sunday.
I asked you that to ask you this. Everyone has a bad night in the NCAA tournament except for the champion. Someone falls flat, comes out flat, has an injury, bad breaks. Very rarely do you get hostile environments unless you're catching like UNC in Raleigh or somewhere, or Duke and Raleigh. But it does happen. With that being said, if there is a kryptonite to this Florida team, what is it other than a bad night coming out flat?
Well, I think if they run into a really good defensive team who gives them some looks they haven't seen before, has a physical front court, and also has a really balanced back court that can take away what Florida likes to do offensively and limit the backdoor cuts and take away all their action and attack the ball. I mean, it's possible that you force this team into double-digit turnovers, you win the rebounding battle, and Florida has a cold shooting night. That could certainly lead to a disappointing loss. I don't want to say it won't, but I go back to that Missouri game from Friday night. I mean, that had all the recipe for success for Florida to lose that game. The Gators had 16 turnovers in the first 33 minutes. They get out-rebounded by kind of a undersized Missouri team. Missouri got 18 offensive rebounds to 9 by the Gators. You get that many second chance opportunities. You get 68 field goal attempts by the Tigers. I mean, they certainly had a chance from a, analytical standpoint to win that game, but Florida managed to overcome it. They managed to get to the line, draw contact, hit shots close to the rim with their, abundance of forwards that I mentioned, knock down open shots, even if it wasn't at the highest rate that we've seen this season. So for Florida, when they play impressive defense, even when they struggle offensively, this is a team that has just shown that they can stay in games and hit big shot after big shot. And when they do that, they are extremely, extremely difficult to beat. They don't get really rattled at a neutral site or on the road either. Yeah, that loss to Tennessee was bad. Like I said, it was an outlier. But on a neutral site, go back to that North Carolina game, which I'm glad we're doing this tonight, because if I had talked about North Carolina yesterday, people would have been like, North Carolina, what are we talking about? But you saw yesterday how they just dismantled San Diego State. That's a talented team. They just didn't have the results that they were expecting to have this season. When Florida played them in Charlotte on the road in front of what was a hostile crowd, neutral site, but you're in North Carolina and those fans are always going to travel well. That really gave Florida an early season test of having to battle at a neutral site in front of a crowd that wasn't in your favor, and they were able to make the plays down the stretch and overcome it, close the last 4 minutes on a really good run when that score was, I think they were trailing there in the last couple of minutes. That really helped them a lot here. So this is one of the reasons why they're built for a deep run in March, even if they end up going to a place where the opposing crowd travels well and they're heckling Todd Golden and heckling the players. This team doesn't seem fazed by it. If anything, I think they're a little bit motivated by it because I mentioned they've had this underdog chip on their shoulder mentality all season long, and it's not difficult to see why. The transfers they added were not highly regarded by national pundits. Elijah Martin was pretty slept on, even though he had been a part of that team at FAU that made the run to the Final Four. Walter Clayton comes from Iona. Will Richard was a former Belmont transfer. Thomas Houck and Alex Condon only had, I think, 1 or 2 SEC offers between them, and those guys look like two of the best forwards in the SEC as sophomores. Denzel Aberdeen is a local kind of guy who grew up a Florida fan and, in my opinion, would start on 85 to 90% of the teams in the country and has done enough, in my opinion, to be a starting guard for Florida next season if that's the route Florida chooses to take. I mean, this is a lot of guys that have an underdog mentality. They were counted out before they even got to Florida, and it all comes from their head coach. Todd Golden started his collegiate career counted out. He was a walk-on at St. Mary's who ended up becoming a starter for that team. On his senior night, he scored in double digits. That's really difficult to do. They were a successful team, and they have fostered this we shouldn't even be here type approach. No one expected us to be here. Yeah, it's the University of Florida, which sounds a little bit funny when you talk about guys who shouldn't be here because you think of that program and all the success they've had over the past 2 decades. But that's what this group is made up of, guys who've been counted out all their lives and now are looking to use that to fuel them to kind of making an improbable run despite the logo that they play with on their jerseys. And that's, I think, what has led them to where they're at and why a lot of people are expecting them to make a lot of noise here in the NCAA tournament.
So, Graham, finally, let's move to Saturday. And let's say that Florida, they're going to advance. And their opponent would be the defending national champions of 2-time defending national champions, UCONN. How do you feel like Florida would match up with UCONN?
Well, Todd Golden, not to cop out of the answer, Todd Golden will tell you that UConn's got to get by Oklahoma first.
Yeah.
And that's an Oklahoma team that has plenty of talent. Jeremiah Fears is one of the best players in the country, as a freshman. UConn's going to have to account for them. And it's a little bit of an underachieving UConn team this year, considering they're back-to-back champs. And it's looking a little bit difficult for them to make make that 3, obviously. And the caliber of the SEC, UConn's got to get through an SEC team that kind of like North Carolina in a sense. A lot of people were telling Oklahoma that they didn't deserve to be in the tournament, that they're lucky to be here. And when you can kind of play without expectations, where everyone counting you out, like I said about Florida, that can be a dangerous recipe when you're facing a team like that. So if UConn, though, does get through Oklahoma and sets up a battle between, Dan Hurley and Todd Golden here, I think that's a really intriguing matchup. UConn is a talented team. They're extremely well coached. For Florida, they're going to have to get balanced scoring once again. They're going to have to feed the low post, play through the low post a lot of the time. They're going to have to be able to create shots and win those one-on-one matchups. They're going to have to avoid turnovers when UConn attacks the ball. It's not going to be an easy contest whatsoever. And UConn fans travel exceptionally well, even with kind of that game being in a legitimate neutral site between Connecticut and Florida, where we'll see how many fans are in attendance for both teams. You would think that Florida, with everything they have to play for, is going to have a ton of fans there in the Lenovo Center. So if that game sets up, the key matchup for me in my mind is Alex Condon. That's the guy who seems to play better as the game goes on. He's really improved as a back-to-the-basket player, just has great vision, limits turnovers, gets you offensive rebounds, finishes through contact. If he has a good game, when he does, Florida is extremely difficult to beat. Even if Walter Clayton has an off night, or Elijah Martin's shot doesn't fall and it rims out and rolls out, or you limit Will Richards' ability to cut to the rim and finish through contact. When Alex Condon is on and Ruben Chinyelu is staying out of foul trouble and Micah Hanlogton is giving you quality minutes off the bench, Florida is extremely difficult to beat. You got to hit shots at a high rate. I go back to that Missouri game that Florida lost earlier in the season by 1 point. Missouri hit 7 3-pointers in the first half. Caleb Grill was out of his mind. He was hitting off-balance shots, catch and shoot, fading away. They got 51 first-half points against the Gators, and Florida was trailing by 17 at halftime. And then Florida comes all the way back. The comeback bid falls short, but this is a team that doesn't throw in the towel. They're resilient. They can score in a bunch of ways. And UConn's going to have to account for every facet of this team if they want to advance the first weekend, if they advance past Oklahoma, which if you look at my bracket, man, I was sitting there racking my brain, wondering who to pick between that Oklahoma-UConn game. I think it's, the 8 and 9 games are such a toss-up in my mind every single year that it's hard for me not to pick the SEC team, just like it was hard for me not to pick the two-time defending national champions. So I'm really intrigued by seeing how that game unfolds, and I know that Florida is preparing to play either opponent if they get past Norfolk State, as they should, on Friday night in Raleigh.
So, Graham, briefly, I actually did pick Oklahoma, but I know a lot of the other national media want UConn to move on in that bracket for the three-peat.
Yeah, I think that you want to root for UConn, right? I mean, that's the team that going 3 in a row would be an incredible feat. And, Dan Hurley, he's either a love him or hate him type coach. If he's your coach, you love the fire, you love him screaming, you love what he gets out of his players. But if you're going against him, you're just like, man, I can't stand that guy.
Yeah.
He just makes for quality television. You want to tune in and you're emotionally invested in one of the two extremes here. So I think that matchup between Florida and UConn will be fascinating. But also, if you're an SEC team, I think you are rooting for the SEC to set up matchups, because not only have you played those teams this season, you've scouted them, you can lean on previous results, but there's this notion out there that the SEC was the deepest conference in college basketball history. They got the most, at-large bids that we've ever seen, right?
Yes.
And if they lose some early games or get upset and you see a bunch of SEC teams fall, you're going to have this narrative out there that the SEC was overrated and that they didn't deserve all these bids. And that's going to be nauseating, man, because they obviously earned it. Look at the non-conference record that these teams put together. It was, less than 20 losses between these 16 SEC teams before conference play got here. Yeah, I know. I guess they went 500 in conference play, but this is an absolute, a brutal conference. You couldn't take any team for granted. Even South Carolina, Florida had to get a final shot in the closing seconds to beat South Carolina in Columbia midway through the SEC slate. Anyone can beat anyone. You saw Texas beat Texas A&M in the conference tournament. You saw upsets. You saw Missouri beat Florida. I mean, this conference is 14 deep. No offense to LSU and South Carolina, but if they don't make some noise in the NCAA tournament, people are going to have those memories where they're like, this group was underrated. They were overhyped, and that's going to be a little bit nauseating. So I can see an argument for either team wanting to advance. If you're an SEC team, though, I think you got to root for the team you've scouted before, the team you've played, and for Florida, a team that they beat by double digits in Gainesville less than a month ago.
Graham, you mentioned Denny Hurley, and you guys talk about him as a coach. I remember him as a player, and he was he was like a gnat. He was very pesky out there. And I remember he got drafted in the NBA. He had a car wreck, and that's what ended his NBA career. It started his coaching career. He was in a very nasty car wreck that ended his career. But with that being said, staying on coaches, we had a couple of guests on here recently. We had Senator Tommy Tuberville, and he thinks that Florida might be the best team in the SEC. He said that on the show. He was talking about how great Bama was, how great Auburn was, but he said, heck, he goes, Florida might be the best team in the whole darn thing. And then we talked to one coach from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, that has a national radio show, Doug Gottlieb. And Doug said this on our show earlier this week. He said, Todd Golden is the absolute best in analytics and basketball today. And I asked him to give us an example, and he said they foul the worst shooter in the closing minutes of the first half just so Florida can get extra possessions. They're going to put the worst shooter on the free throw line right before the first half in the last 2 minutes of the first half, so they can just get extra possessions to try to pull away or extend before you go into halftime. And that just really amazed me. But he said, as far as analytics, no one in the country, zero, does it better than Todd Golden. And he even said he would like to see Todd win a national title this year. Now, I just put the pressure on him. But with that being said, what do you know about the analytics of this Florida team? And is the senator and a head college basketball coach wrong?
No, he's not, and I can't believe you got me on here. No offense, Heath. You got me on here agreeing with Tommy Tuberville, who kind of is like Dan Hurley right now. Either love him or hate him, it seems. I mean, that's a good take by him, though. I think that from an analytical perspective, for so long, it seemed like in-game coaching was about feel and making a decision in the moment. But Florida has analyzed the game to the point where they have decided ahead of time what they're going to do in several situations, and give his coaching staff a lot of credit, especially Jonathan Sapphire. They've looked at the analytics consistently. This is an analytical based approach that Florida takes to coaching. And I know that some people out there are just, not a fan of analytics because they want in-game adjustments. They want to look at coaching as what you're calling in the moment, what you're drawing up based on what you're seeing. And there's a lot of that, of course, but there's so many scenarios, like you mentioned. If a team has, 32 seconds left on the clock before halftime, and you have a chance to, maybe get a 2-for-1 if you're on offense, or foul the team's worst shooter and then get the projected points, send someone to the line for a 1-and-1. And that's like what, 0.8 projected points. And then if they miss the first one and you get the possession, you then have a chance at 1.5 projected points, depending on, the situation and especially your team and who you have in your backcourt. So Florida's going to look to maximize stuff like that. And that's going to, in their opinion, give them a better approach here as they get into March, because as you saw last night, this is a game that comes down to one or two possessions a lot of the time, and maximizing each one, giving yourself as many opportunities as possible to win the game is something that you got to do. You can't play with regrets. You got to foul up three. You got to foul the worst shooters. You have to make wise subs to avoid getting your stars into foul trouble. You have to go down to the low post and use your guys at a high rate, even if sometimes the matchup isn't favorable, to get to the line and get the other team in foul trouble. You have to look at how teams do when they have players not in the rotation. You have to look at all these things as you get into March. And in my opinion, that's more important than drawing up in-game plays and, baseline out of bounds plays. Those are great, of course, and they're very valuable. But for Florida, it's a lot of the other little things that we're still kind of in the advent of analytics in basketball. There's going to be more and more and more as time goes on, which is really exciting to me that they're finding new ways to quantify how to be successful and how to be able to make a deep run and win games and give yourself a better percentage. And this is something that Florida's coaching staff has done. They had conviction when they got to Gainesville that this analytical based approach would work. Randy Bennett was someone who instilled that in Todd Golden. Obviously, he learned on, Auburn's coaching staff as well when he was there a decade ago. This is someone who has been around the game, has picked up from a lot of mentors how to do things the right way. And now Florida's reaping the rewards, or at least they're hoping to reap the rewards as they get into March and into April here. They're not going to be satisfied with just an SEC tournament championship, because if they look back at the end of the year and that's all they accomplished, they're going to be a little bit disappointed, because they feel like they have all the components to do some noise, do some damage, make some noise here in the NCAA tournament. And it starts with Todd Golden, and it goes down to the guys that he acquired and brought to Gainesville, from the coaching staff, who has been here all for 3 years, the same guys, which seems to be a little bit more and more rare in college basketball, to the players that he brought out of the portal who have an underdog mentality and are looking to prove themselves and everyone wrong who slept on them before they got to Gainesville.
So, Graham, look, man, be safe traveling to Raleigh to cover the Gators. Good luck to Florida against Norfolk State on Thursday, on Friday. And then good luck to them against either UConn or Oklahoma. And we will catch up with you next week as we move forward with the Florida Gators, moving towards cutting down the nets again, this time for a national championship.
It'd be awesome to see. It was crazy that on Sunday was my first time covering a conference championship in now 10 years, going on 11 years on the Florida beat. We'd seen many opportunities in football. The SEC championship just hadn't happened yet. So it was cool seeing the confetti fall for Florida. I'm hoping to be able to travel for as long as we can this season here, starting with Raleigh this weekend. We'll see if they get to San Francisco one game at a time, maybe San Antonio if everything goes their way. So Thanks for having me, guys. It's always a pleasure. Looking forward to catching up with you next week after what should be an exciting trip up in Raleigh. I'm going to go pack and try and get a little bit of sleep here and catch Florida's open practice tomorrow in Raleigh. It's going to be a great time.
And when you have dinner with Senator Tuberville, you can tell us about the other things you agree with him on.
You got it. I'll give you guys a scoop.
Hey,
Thanks, Graham.
go Gators, man. Let's go.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right.
Take care, Graham.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Graham Hall of 247 Sports The Gators. And the Gators play on Friday in Raleigh, like we've talked about. When we come back, we are going to be joined by Dave Shoemate of SEC Unfiltered to get his take on the entire tournament and which SEC team has the hardest path to the national championship. That's on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Stingray Show. We will be right back after this.